Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of day one of FTP on data science for the next decade. We are privileged to have such an eminent academician here with us, Dr. Ebin Dheniraj, Assistant Professor, Faculty in Charge Academics at IIIT Kottayam. He is ACM Distinguished Speaker in Data Science. He completed his MTech in Information Technology from VIT University and PhD from School of Information Technology and Engineering, VIT. His honors and achievement are he was selected among the top 25 programmers in IEEE Extreme Programmers League organized by IEEE at VIT, Best Thesis Award by CSI, jury member of Innovation in Data Science in 11th edition of Aegis Graham Bell Awards, and he has a cumulative SCI impact factor of 20.523. He has many research publications in reputed journals and international conferences, and he is also reviewer of various renowned journals such as Journal on Wireless Communication and Networking, International Journal of Data Science and Analytics, IEEE Transaction on Emerging Topics in Computing, a few to mention. His area of research interest includes online social network analysis, social computing, auto ML, computer vision, responsible AI. May I now invite Dr. Ebin Dheniraj for the session on design patterns in machine learning.
Yeah, thank you, and a very good afternoon to all of you. So I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and also you can see the slides, right?
Yes, sir.
Great. Yeah. So once again, a very good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for giving this platform to share my thoughts on machine learning design patterns. And before I begin my actual talk on machine learning design patterns, I thought I'll say a few things about the institute which I belong. So as already mentioned here, I'm from IIIT Kottayam. So it's an institution of national importance which was established in the year 2015, and it's a fully residential campus. And also we have various programs, that is UG and PG programs in computer science. And to mention few things, we have PG program, that is MTech, for MTech, which is designed specifically for working professionals. Right now we have two courses, that is MTech in AI and data science, and another one is MTech in cyber security. So and also we have very good response for these programs. We have students from both core companies as well as service-based companies. So, and in addition to that, we also have PhD programs. I'm sure there are some scholars even from Talkage. So I hope already you know about it. And in addition to that, we have different funding as well as MOU from both from industrial companies as well as from renowned premier institutes. So just to show a few snippets of the campus, this is how the campus looks like. So of course, because of the pandemic, we are also running the things in online mode right now. And to talk about the data science research group at IIIT, we have people around 9 to 10 people working in various variety of domains in data science, especially with respect to spatial data, data science, deep learning, computer vision, drones, and robotics. Right? Now, coming back to the particular thing which I intended to do today, that is basically design patterns in machine learning. So I'll be focusing on, or I'll be trying to give you a kind of a big picture about the types of design patterns existing in machine learning, and ultimately the focus will be on the question like what are some of the best practices in machine learning. And also let me tell you, I'm talking with the assumption that all of you know the basics of machine learning or basics of data processing. At least, even if you haven't worked on it, at least you've heard of it, and you know some things in ML and data science. That is the assumption I'm making. So kindly forgive me for that, because when we're talking about design patterns, so this is the basic assumption which I'm making. And towards the as we progress, we'll discuss some of the design patterns with use cases. And I also know that it's very difficult to listen to a lecture at a time like this. So I'll try to make it as interesting as possible with as many examples as possible. And and moving on to this particular topic. So basically, as I mentioned, introductory machine learning usually focus on what and how machine learning, or what and how you solve a problem using machine learning. And also you may have certain mathematical aspects of new methods from AI, or like, so basically to implement these frameworks to, or implement these methods. So I'll not be focusing on those fundamental topics of machine learning. Instead, I'll directly go to these patterns, right? So this is the outline that I'm trying to cover in this particular talk. So we'll start off with the very basic things, like what is a design pattern and how it is going to play a role in machine learning, and also why it is required to have design patterns in machine learning. Because already I'm sure people from computer science background would have definitely heard and used design patterns in software engineering, right? But design patterns in machine learning is a kind of very new field, hardly, which is maybe people started talking about it hardly 2 to 3 years back only, and more work started happening maybe in the last few months only. So it's a very fresh and relevant topic, and we'll try to discuss 4 or 5 such patterns, because it's not possible to cover all the patterns. So that's what I've earlier said. I'll try to give a bird's eye view of these ML design patterns, right? Now, to talk about design patterns, what are exactly design patterns, right? So we have seen in software engineering, or if you have learned about object-oriented programming languages, or object-oriented programming design, or object-oriented analysis and design, or whichever course which you have heard of. So we can say that these are formalized kind of best practices to solve common problems in software or in software industry, right? So to say something very naive about design pattern is that a design pattern is a kind of reusable solution to the commonly occurring problem. So in software engineering, this concept dates back all the way to the 1980s, when Beck and Cunningham started to, just a second. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So basically, it dates back all the way to the 1980s, where this two people called Beck and Cunningham, they started to apply this concept to programming, right? So maybe around early 2000s, you have this whole domain, or whole IT vertical called design patterns, especially the solid design principles of object-oriented programming. So this were considered as a kind of common knowledge to programmers. So if you fast forward 15 years, say by 2015 or so, we arrive at the era of software 2.0, where machine learning models started to replace this classical functions in more and more places of the code, right? And more companies started migrating to this ML AI domain. So today we look at software as a fusion of traditional code, machine learning models, and the underlying data, right? So this fusion requires a seamless integration of these components, which is often kind of far from trivial, given the field's often disparate history and evolution, because all of these things are changing, right? So design patterns, however, have not been extended yet to deal with the challenges of this new era. So the new era means the software 2.0. So in software 2.0, the common challenges do not appear not only at the core, but also at the level of problem definition, data representation. Then if you're talking about training methods, or if you want to scale your particular prototype into a different level, or if you're considering the ethical aspects of these AI-enabled systems. So all these parameters are not being taken into account in these design patterns, right? So basically, this creates a lot of opportunity, or I would say this creates a fertile ground for the practice of machine learning anti-patterns. So what do you mean by an anti-pattern? So usually design patterns, even in software engineering, even though we say you have this pattern, but always there are certain trade-offs and certain exceptions, right? So this kind of anti-patterns definitely exist when you are combining machine learning with the software engineering, right? So unfortunately, uh, not much focus is actually given to this combination of software engineering and machine learning, right? So definitely, but this is very relevant because when you are working on a real machine learning problem, this is something which many times people felt that this is required, or this kind of a design pattern, if it is there, then it would be easy to kind of connect with people or connect with the problems in such a way that this is not a problem which I'm seeing for the first time. So this other people are also seeing this kind of problem. So there could be a best practice for this. So this kind of scenario, this kind of a thought process have never existed in the domain of machine learning, right? So in the common scenario of machine learning, say after collecting, cleaning and preparing the data, so the engineer or the poor person who does that, it trains, he or she trains the first model or the minimum viable model, right? And let's assume that it shows very bad performance on the testing data. So a common anti-pattern to replace this first model is actually to replace it with the complex one, so that obviously it can or it may improve the performance by this, right? So, uh, so what I can say is that this kind of design pattern, we can say that it's a kind of even a kind of error analysis in this machine learning domain. So, this in practice means that uh, where a model made errors either by assessing the model to be fit on different data sets, or even by looking at individual cases where our model was wrong. So, although uh, maybe we all heard saying that garbage in and garbage out. Sometimes certain machine learning model, sarcastically we say this, right? So still very few people appreciates how much this is true for little inconsistencies in the data. So maybe let's assume if you are doing a classification problem and you want to do certain labeling, right? So maybe the labels are coming from different sources. They may having like their own or slightly different interpretation of the labeling guidelines, right? So these things will happen in a real life machine learning project, right? So and another thing is maybe the way of collecting the data could have changed over time, right? So all we are trying to do is maybe a possible error analysis could be done if you are considering this machine learning design patterns, right? So just one primary example could be like, nobody would have thought that the year 2020, you have this much amount of disruption happening. So the 2020 in all ways, it was a year of digital disruption, right? Because everything, it has kind of changed it in that few months, right? Because of the pandemic, right? So maybe companies who are kind of hesitant to move to cloud, they happily move to cloud because they don't have any other option. So that's why it is 2020 can be clearly said as a year of digital disruption, because to happen something of that sort, that is more companies moving to a cloud or more people using internet, it would have taken maybe 5 to 10 years to achieve that growth. But the pandemic has actually made it possible in happening in less than 1 year, right? So any model you deploy or any machine learning problem you're trying to solve, you build a model, and obviously that model is succumb to kind of a performance degradation over time, right? So the model goes through extensive validation and is kind of deployed into production. So the users are happy and they give kind of good feedback saying that, hey, this model is predicting good. Now let's assume that a month or a quarter, or let's say a year later, uh, you might get certain reports saying that there are flaws in the production, or flaws in the prediction, right? So this could be usually a kind of manifestation of some problem in your model, right? That could be with the data, or that could be with the kind of problem which you are dealing, and you wouldn't have considered certain aspects of the problem, right? So maybe in the later slides I'll talk about something called concept drift, right? So where your model learned between input and output has actually changed over time, right? So I'll be explaining more about this, so I'll not say what is that concept drift right now, but I'll be explaining it with an example in a while. So basically, uh, design patterns, again, we can say that they are a kind of continuous evaluation of performance, which means that you expect drifts to happen, and hence design the system to notice it as soon as possible. So this is completely a different approach, as the focus is not on the speed of reaction, but on the speed of detection. So this puts the entire system, or your entire ML system or entire AI system, in a much more controlled course, giving more room for prioritization of any reaction. Right? So ultimately, continuous evaluation means establishing a set of processes and tools to kind of continuously generate ground truth for a fraction of the new data. So in ML, we know that ground truth is something which you can make use to compare it with your predicted results, right? So that is a crucial part in all the ML projects, right? If you don't have ground truth, it's kind of difficult to validate whatever you have done is right or wrong. Even in the case of supervised as well as unsupervised learning, ground truth definitely it has a lot of role to play, right? Now, the reason why we talk about machine learning design patterns is that there are different job opportunities in the ML and data science world. So, uh, as per the year 2020, these are some of the different roles which you can say exist in the ML and data science domain. So, usually a data scientist, you call someone as who's focusing on collecting, interpreting, and processing the data sets, and they could have a better edge with statistical and exploratory analysis on data. And as it relates to machine learning, a data scientist may work on data collection, they do feature engineering, they might build models and more, right? So obviously, data scientists may work maybe either in Python or R or Julia, or I can say they usually they will be the one to if you take in an organization, they'll be the first one to build a model or build a machine learning model, right, for any of the tasks. That is the task of a data scientist, right? But if you look at the task of a data engineer, they are more focused on towards the infrastructure and workflows powering in an organization's data. So they might help to grab the data, they might help you to building data pipelines, and they also take care of how the data is stored and transferred. So basically, all this infrastructure and pipelines around the data is actually built by this data engineer. So you can think about it in such a way that you can think about Hadoop, or you can think about Spark. I'm sure even in this FTP series, you have certain sessions with Apache Stream, which focus on stream processing. So in all these things, you have a framework, and you need someone to maintain that framework so that the data scientist can actually do the job in a proper way. So usually I tell you an example where you can think of data scientists as if you're thinking them as a building. So data scientists are the painters in that building, while the data engineers are kind of the are known as the plumbers in that building. So they actually build the framework, and they only make sure that your data flows around seamlessly in and around the building, right? And there is another category which has come in the recent times, which is known as ML engineers or machine learning engineers. They do, I'm sorry, they do similar tasks similar to data engineers, but for they will be more focused on the ML model, right? So they take models developed by data scientists and manage these infrastructure and operations around this like training and deploying these models. So ML engineers help to build production systems to especially in handling and updating models, and also something like model versioning, and also to basically ML engineer is the one who actually gives this model to the user end or to the customer. Or if you're thinking like say for example, if you build an app which can kind of predict something, ML engineer is the one who might be working on that app application part, right? So he he's the one who might be integrating both these things, right? So also, whenever you talk about data science, it is always expected to have a small data science team, so that your output is going to be better. That's what statistically it is said. And in addition to that, you have a research scientist and also applied data scientist, right? So research scientists focus primarily on finding and developing new algorithms to kind of advance this discipline of ML. And this also includes subfields of ML, like say we can think about building model architectures, or building something in NLP, natural language processing, or computer vision, or you can think about hyperparameter tuning, or you can think about anything in responsible AI, that is something like model interpretability, right? So unlike the roles which I've discussed just now, you can say that research scientists spend most of their time prototyping and evaluating new approaches to ML rather than building out, say, real production ML systems. So especially, it usually most of the things happen in the academia domain, right? So I'm just giving you this overall view so that which section of the people or which out of these roles, which set of people are more likely to see this kind of machine learning design patterns, right? So if I'm just reorienting yourself into a different thing, the same thing, I'm just converting it into different role. So you can think like whatever that you see on the bottom side in blue color, that is actually the kind of machine learning flow, or any machine learning project if you take. That's how it is done. You take the data, you validate it, you prepare it, you build a model, you evaluate the model, you validate it, and finally the model is given to the user end, right? So you can see all these roles, and also like where exactly you have the role of data engineer, where exactly you have the role of data scientist, right? So most of the design patterns, it is actually seen by either the data scientist or the ML engineer. So these are the two different people which might see these patterns more frequent, right? So as I said, there are many different job roles related to data and machine learning. These roles collaborate on the ML workflow, as I'm saying, as I've shown here. So basically, this particular figure, it shows the different roles, how they work together throughout an organization's machine learning model development process, right? So ultimately, this is just to give you an overview, like who all will be seeing these patterns and who all will be facing these kind of problems more in an actual machine learning project, right? So before I move to these patterns, it's very relevant to talk about few of the common challenges which most of the people will be facing whenever they start working in an ML project, right? So also, this will actually kind of point you to the relevance of why machine learning design patterns are important, because till now I have talked about machine learning. I've talked about what is design patterns, but at least some of you may have asked the question in your mind, like what exactly is machine learning design patterns, right? How do you combine these two things? So when we talk about machine learning models, these models are only as reliable as the data used to train them. Whatever data is in front of them, with that only it is being trained, right? So there are certain cases which can kind of validate it. So at least 10, 15 years back, the US defense was actually working on a machine learning project, to be specific, on a computer vision project, which actually it had the capability to detect the patent tanks in a battlefield, right? So they have a lot of images, and they trained this particular model, and they thought that they got a very good model, right? And when they were actually kind of testing it, it was found that that particular model, it's not detecting that particular patent tanks, right? So then they started to analyze what exactly went wrong. So then they found out that the initial training data which was fed into this particular model, it had consisted of mostly the sky color, or the color of the sky in those photographs was mostly blue or bluish in nature, right? And the kind of testing data, or when they wanted to test it, the color of the sky was kind of cloudy and you didn't have any blue tinge in that particular image, right? So what this model has done is, instead of learning to detect this patent tags, what it has started detecting is, it has actually learned to detect only this blue color of the sky. So that's why we always say machine learning models are only as reliable as the data used to train them. So maybe this could definitely make you understand what is the relevance of the data which is being fed into this any machine learning model, right? So, and the other aspects is, so as you can see here, mainly we'll be focusing on three things. One is with respect to data quality. The other one will be with respect to reproducibility. So unless and until you are able to reproduce the results, then otherwise the other kind of, that is, if you are not able to reproduce any of the results, then such kind of frameworks or such kind of models are of not any use, right? Then in the end, we'll talk about three things, that is drift, scale, and the objectives to be achieved under a problem, right? So after talking about these three things, then we'll move on to the actual topic, that is machine learning design patterns. So when you talk about data quality, you need to always think about the data accuracy. So it refers to both your training data's features and the ground truth labels corresponding with those features. So when we say ground truth, it basically means that you have, say, if I have a textual data, you already know what is the result of that, but you remove that particular last column and you try to train your model, and it is asked to predict. So once you have the predicted results, you just compare it with the earlier removed column. So just to compare and see whether whatever your model has done is right or wrong. Right? That's what in 2 or 3 sentences you can say accuracy means. Right? So ultimately, even though we talk about accuracy, it's also important to go through your data, that whatever that has been collected, to basically check for any inconsistencies in the tabular meta, or whether you have any missing features or any other errors that may affect this data quality. So, and also another aspect would be, say, duplicates in your training data set. It can cause your model to incorrectly assign more weight to these data points, right? So in addition to that, accurate labels are just important as this feature accuracy. Your model relies solely on the ground truth labels in your training data to update its weights and minimum loss. And as a result, incorrectly labeled training examples can cause misleading model accuracy. So that is one aspect. And also the completeness of the data. Let's say you are training a model to identify cat breeds, which particular breed a particular cat belongs to. So you train the model on an extensive data set of cat images, and the resulting model is able to classify images onto, say, onto 10 different categories. So say you have a Siamese cat, or you have a say normal Indian cat. So obviously you did it, and you are able to achieve an accuracy of around, say, 99%, right? So when you deploy your model onto production, however, you find that in addition to uploading cat photos for your classification, many of your users, that is, imagine that you have done this job to some other person, and the person who has uploaded these training images, by mistake, he has uploaded photos of dogs as well. So obviously, that may have a reflection in your model as well. So because the model was trained only to identify 10 different cat breeds, this is all it knows to do, right? So these 10 categories are essentially the model's entire worldview. Other than that, the model doesn't know anything, right? So no matter what you send the model, you can expect it to slot it to one of these 10 categories. So even if you are trying to give a picture of a dog, still it will sort it out and say that it belongs to either of these one of these categories. It may even do so with high confidence for an image that looks nothing like a cat, right? So additionally, there is no way your model will be able to return not a cat if this data and label weren't included in the training data set, right? So that is with respect to the data completeness. And in addition to that, the third aspect is actually with respect to data quality is actually data consistency. So for large data sets, it's very common to divide the work of data collection and labeling among a group of people. So usually we do this very common whenever you have this labeling task. And if some students are really interested to work on a real ML problem, sometimes we give this task to them so that like they'll understand how exactly these things work. And at the same time, we'll also get this thing done, right? So developing a set of standards for this process can help to ensure consistency across your data set, since each person involved in this will be kind of bringing their own biases to the process. So like data completeness, data inconsistencies can be found both in data features as well as in this labeling aspect. So for example, of inconsistent features, let's say you're collecting atmospheric data from temperature sensors, right? So if each sensor has been calibrated to different standards, it can definitely result in inaccurate and unreliable model predictions. So inconsistencies can also refer to data format. So if you're capturing location data and let's say you have asked to write the district name, right, from where that particular data was collected, right? And some people, let's say, assume that they have written it as Kochi, and some people have written this as Cochin, right? So basically, if you are considering both, you need to tell the model that both these places are the same, right? So that is with respect to the consistency aspect of data. And another aspect is timeliness. That is the latency between when an event occurred and when it was added to your database. That is also really, really important when you are actually working on a real ML problem, right? And the other aspect is actually reproducibility. So in traditional programming, the output of a program is reproducible and is guaranteed. Every time you run a program in, say, let's say, any object-oriented program or any sequential program which you want to run, like whenever you for a set of input, you always have the same set of output. That is guaranteed. But machine learning models, on the other hand, they have an inherent element of randomness embedded into it, right? So in training ML model weights, in the case of training model, these weights are initialized with random values. So you can link that to any of the neural network or deep learning, this thing, always that randomness is there. So basically these weights which you have assigned, they converge during training as the model iterates and learns from these data. So because of this, the same model code given the same training data will or may produce slightly different results across the training runs. So there are ways to actually kind of minimize that, but still, when compared to traditional programming, you don't have a simple solution for that, right? So this actually introduces the challenge of reproducibility. So if you train a model to 98.1% accuracy, maybe the next time you are running, you're not guaranteed to reach the same result. So this can make it difficult to run comparisons across the experiments. So, and also reproducibility also applies to even machine learning framework dependencies. So in addition to, say, you would have heard of setting random seed in a machine learning, say, when you're building a machine learning model, right? So, so obviously this frameworks also implement elements of randomness. So you think about anything like TensorFlow or PyTorch, all of this will have some randomness inside that, right? So if this underlying implementation changes between different framework versions, then also repeatability is not guaranteed. So an example is, let's say you have certain libraries, and let's assume that a library like TensorFlow. So let's assume you have a new update, and sometimes what happens is something which was perfectly working fine in your model suddenly will stop working because of that update, right? So all this is with respect to this reproducibility. And the last thing where I want to, another challenge which is very important is actually data drift. So data drift actually refers to the challenge of ensuring that your machine learning models stay relevant, and also the model predictions are kind of an accurate reflection of the environment in which they are being used, right? So let's say you're training a model to classify news article. So you have headlines such as say categories or headlines or categories like politics, business, and say technology. Right? These are the three different categories, and you want to kind of say classify it into any of these three buckets. Right? So you have a news article coming, and you need to say whether it belongs to politics or to business or technology. Now, if you train and evaluate your model on historical news articles from 20th century, most likely or 100% it is sure that it will not perform as well or as good as the current data. So today we know that the word smartphone in the headline is probably about technology. But if you are training this thing with the 20th century data, it may not even know what a phone is or what a smartphone is. Right? So how a model trained on historical data would have no knowledge of this particular word, say smartphone. That is another aspect. So, and then another aspect or another challenge is actually with respect to scaling. The challenge of scaling is present in a typical machine learning workflow. You're likely to encounter scaling challenges in all the workflow of a machine learning problem or machine learning scenario, right? Right from ingesting or right from consuming data and preparing data for machine learning model to the stage of deploying the model and maintaining it. In all these cases, scaling it could be really a difficult problem in the actual industry. So basically, for model training, ML engineers are responsible for determining the necessary infrastructure which are required for a specific training job, right? So that comes with practice only, because earlier you may not be knowing how much infrastructure may be required for a particular data, whether you require infrastructure like GPUs or any computationally expensive infrastructure is required or not, right, for these ML workloads. Right? So let's assume image models. You have built something on images, and for instance, typically require much more training infrastructure than models that were trained entirely on tabular data. So that is quite obvious. Textual data, it requires not much computationally expensive hardware or computationally expensive infrastructure. So both these developers and ML engineers are typically responsible for handling these scaling challenges. Right? So there are, in addition to that, sometimes when you're working on a problem, there could be multiple objectives, right? So even if there is a single team responsible for building a machine learning model, many teams across an organization will make use of the model in some way. So inevitably, these teams may have different ideas of what defines a successful model, because as we say, each human being's perspective may change, right? To understand this, how this may play out in practice, let's say you're building a model to identify defective products from images. This is a very common use case where you have a conveyor belt going and you have these defective products coming in that belt. And as a data scientist, let's say your goal is to minimize your model's cross entropy loss. So I'm not going to say what is that, but if you are interested in that, you can just Google it. And let's assume that another person, if you are thinking, and basically that person want to reduce the number of defective products that are misclassified and sent to, say, the users or sent to the customers, right? And if you think about another team in the same organization, let's say executive team, their goal may be to increase the revenue by 30%. So each of these goals vary in what they are optimizing for. So whatever a programmer's perspective could be different from the management, or it could be completely different from the customer perspective, right? So some sort of balancing definitely is required to have a kind of a good ML model. So when you are defining a goal for a particular model, it's important to consider all these different aspects so that like you can have a better model. So ultimately, this actually paves the kind of foundation for machine learning design patterns. So design patterns are a kind of way to kind of codify the knowledge and experience of experts into advice that kind of all practitioners can follow. It will be a kind of a standard or a kind of benchmark. So we tend to use different ML design patterns at different stages of machine learning lifecycle. So these are patterns that are useful in problem framing and also to assess the feasibility of whether something can be done or not. The majority of these patterns either, patterns address either the development or this deployment, and also there are quite a few patterns which are kind of involved in both these two, right? So I know it's been quite some time, and it's also in afternoon, so it's always good to have a short break. So we'll take a very short 1-minute break, and you can just move your eyes away from the screen and just think about what exactly is the relevance of design patterns, and also like why is it important to have design patterns in machine learning. Right. So, so we have been talking about the relevance of design patterns, and also why is it required in the case of machine learning. So already we have discussed about the various challenges usually faced in an ML project, right? So if you're thinking about design patterns, there are a lot of design patterns right now being identified. So if you count all of these, it's right now more than 30 design patterns have been detected or have been discussed, right? So we'll not discuss all of those, but selectively we'll discuss some of those, right? So in a broadly, you can say there are certain design patterns with respect to data representation. There are certain design patterns with respect to the problem representation, and also when you're training a model, there are certain design patterns which you can follow, and also with respect to resilience serving, or basically with the adaptability of the model, or like you deploy a model and like without making much changes, how do you actually use the same model over a long period of time, right? And the fifth aspect is reproducibility. So that also will have a lot of patterns, and in the end we have responsible AI. So talking about all of these patterns, it's impossible. So I have selected certain patterns out of this. So we'll be discussing about 5 different patterns in 4 different categories. So the reason why I've left model training and responsible AI is that itself can be taken as a very big topic and can be done as a different session. So that's the reason why I haven't considered model training and responsible AI. Rest from all the other 4 aspects, these are the 5 different ML design patterns which we'll be discussing in this session, right? So as I said, we'll talk about data representation, problem representation, then resilience serving, and also the reproducibility aspect. So you should be able to link this to the challenges which I've mentioned already. And also, as far as possible, I'll try to explain with use cases and also with examples, so that you'll be able to connect it to what exactly I'm talking about. Now, when you talk about data representation, a design pattern, so there are many design patterns available. Out of that, we'll be talking about one particular pattern known as embeddings, right? So embeddings are a kind of learnable data representation that map kind of very high cardinal data into a lower dimensional space in such a way that the information relevant to the learning problem is still preserved. So embeddings are at the heart of modern day machine learning and have various kind of variations throughout the field, right? So ultimately, it actually converts this high cardinality data into lower dimensional space, right? So machine learning models systematically, they look for patterns in data. They capture how the properties of models input features related to the output label, and as a result, the sorry, the data representation of the input features directly affects the quality of the final model. This I have already mentioned. So while handling structured numeric input, it is fairly straightforward. The data need to train on machine learning model. It can come in different varieties as well. So it need not be always in a structured format, right? So you may have categorical features, you may have text, you may have images, audio, you may have time series, and many more, right? So for these data representation, we need a meaningful numeric value to be supplied to our machine learning model so that these features can fit within the typical training paradigm. Now, embeddings can provide a way to handle some of these disparate data types in a way that preserves similarity between items and thus improves our model's ability to learn those essential patterns. So the embeddings design pattern addresses the problem of representing high cardinality data densely in a lower dimension by passing the input data through an embedding layer that has trainable weights. So this will actually map the high dimensional categorical category. Maybe it can be categorical, it can be numerical. So I'm just assuming it is a categorical data. So input variables into a kind of real valued vector in some low dimensional space, right? So because embeddings capture a closeness relationship in the input data and convert it into a lower dimensional representation, we can use embedding layer as a replacement for clustering technique. We know that clustering is a unsupervised machine learning approach, right? So you can also replace things like principal component analysis, PCA, or any sort of dimensionality reduction can be done using a layer of embedding, right? So you don't have to do PCA, you don't have to do clustering. So ultimately, these embedding weights are determined in the main model training loop, and thus saving the need to cluster or to do PCA as a separate task. So in order to make this more interesting, what I'll do is, let's assume that we want to understand what is an embedding. So let's think about a typical ML problem. Let's say we want to recommend movies to customers. How would we do that? Well, we basically have a bunch of customers. Say let's say 10 million customers, and we have say 500,000 movies, and we basically have ratings by those customers for a few of those movies, right? The movies that they have watched. So given this, what do we want to do? So what we want to predict basically, or we want to suggest movies to customers that are like the ones they have liked in the past. So one way we could do this is that we could basically say, okay, let me organize the movies by some sort of similarity measure. So we could do the average age of viewers with Shrek on the left hand side, that is for kids, and Memento on the right hand side is kind of dark and is very kind of adult oriented. And then we arrange the movies by that dimension, and then based on that we could basically then say, if you tend to like kids movies, here are more kids movies and there for you. But of course, as you can see, that with one dimension isn't a very good idea. So it will be good to actually organize it by multiple dimensions, so that we'll have a second dimension. So it might look something of this sort. So a second dimension, which is the amount of ticket sales of that particular movie. And then we basically have at the bottom, we have the art house movies, and at the top we have the mass production movies. And now we basically have two dimensions, and we can think about extending it so that you have n dimensions or d dimensions, where you basically have your input and you have your movies. So you may have 500,000 movies, so you have 500,000 dimensions, because you're going to be one hot encoding the movie, so that you and your dimensionality reduction into, you can do dimensionality reduction into d-dimensional points, right? So you may have little vagueness in whatever I've just said, but this, to understand it in this way, just with an embedding layer, you can replace, or you don't have to do clustering, you don't have to do PCA, but you will be able to achieve this kind of a thing. Instead of n, that can be reduced to a d-dimensional thing, right? So you can extend it into different ways. Let's say you can even give the access some kind of names. Let's say on the top you have blockbuster and the bottom you have art house movies, right? So what we could do is that we could basically take these coordinate points, so these coordinate points are what we are calling the embedding. So Shrek, for example, is a negative one because it's for children. It's a blockbuster, and that's the embedding, right? So we could basically take this embedding, but the axis, but this particular axis do not have names, and the question is that how do you get these axes right? That is, how do you know that this is a blockbuster and this is an art house thing, right? So this embedding layer, it actually places in that particular portion so that you will be able to understand that in some way you can actually kind of categorize it, right? So this is how it looks like, right? Yeah. So embeddings are a great way in which the question is like, what kind of model do we get it right, so that in case if you're training and if you're doing an embedding, so that say for example if you're getting a 4-dimensional embedding, so you can call that as a latent factor or a related factor, where one way we could do this is by you could train your model where basically you have one hot encoded the data. So one hot encoding means if you have read about categorical data, there is a particular scheme in which you can actually convert that categorical data into numbers. Just I can show here, right? The movies right now are given some sort of numbers or some sort of encodings. So, or you can even call it as a dummy variables, right? So, so you can pass it through the dimensionality that you want to do this, and obviously you will be able to get an embedding out of that, right? So ultimately you will be able to get a kind of a clustering or a kind of lower dimension without doing any of the other time consuming task. So this is the beauty of this design pattern known as embedding, right? So obviously there are other aspects to these embeddings. So how do you get these learning tasks? Of course, the problem with training a model like this, we'll need labeled data, right? So let's assume any supervised learning task, you require labeled data. So, but for doing this labeling task, it is very time consuming and also it is very expensive. And the nicest thing is that if you can create an auxiliary learning task where the learning program is actually or you can create a learning program where you don't have to spend much time and effort in creating the labels. So when we do embeddings, we always look for auxiliary learning tasks where we don't have to do any sort of labeling, and you can always use more data so that we are very familiar with this. So when we look at word embeddings, we basically let's say I've given a particular example here. Let's say you have a sentence like the cat sits on the dash, right? So you have a lot of options for that. So let's assume you basically go to all the books that we have and we basically take sentences out of those books and we say, here is a context, the cat sits on the, and make it predict what is the next word, right? So the cool thing here is that there is so much label data around, and because we don't have to actually do anything manual to achieve this. And the nice thing is that this embedding that we create is very general, that it actually captures the information content that is relevant to predicting the next word. It's not about a very specific kind of text classification. So this is basically the kind of a word to vector idea. So you can have a variety of these learning tasks. It's not only with respect to textual classification, also it can be used in the case of images. So for the images, the auxiliary learning task is always sometimes known as the autoencoders. So the idea is you take your image, you basically one hot encode it. So again, I'm saying one hot encode is, you can think about it in this way. Usually image you can represent it as an array of pixel values. And when you one hot encode it, you're actually creating a dummy variable and you're actually converting those pixel values into some other form in which you can easily access and you can easily do some processing, right? So you take an image and you one hot encode it and you pass it through a set of convolution layers, and let's say you have some sampling layers, and then you basically try to reconstruct the original image back, and in between you basically have the bottleneck layer, and in this case you basically get a two-dimensional embedding of the original image. And the embeddings, if you do them right, then you have properly regularized. And so on the one of the result of embedding is that very much similar items, you will get it very close to each other. So the result of embedding is that similar items are very close to each other, and the vector directions will always have a meaning. So to make it more clear, maybe in this figure, if you observe the left-hand diagram, you have all the reds which are of value 9, and all these things are close together, and all of these are ones, and these are close together, and nearby items are very similar to each other. So all these 9s and also 4s, you can think about how 9 and 4 are basically differ only in the top curve, and the embedding has basically recognized that and put those things close together. So it's possible to do arithmetic and vector arithmetic. Like let's say if you are taking this particular thing, just give me a second. Yeah. So if you are thinking about this particular example, so if you want to take if you are considering two different vector points, a man and a woman, then you would say how much do I have to add to a man to get a woman? So you add the same thing to the king and queen, right? So on this, vector dimensions have meaning, similar items in such a way that they're close to each other, so the same things can be kind of interpreted, and you have your embedding. You can use this property in different amazing ways. So another thing is, when I started talking about embeddings, so I started with movies and recommendation. So well, this is basically how you recommend songs also, right? So when you think about Amazon Music or Spotify, whenever it gets basically a brand new song, how did it basically recommend that particular song? Because nobody has listened to that song before. It's a kind of a cold start problem, where you have things which are coming into the model which you haven't seen before. So one way to do that is to look at the kind of sounds that it contains and use it to find similar songs, and say if you have earlier liked slow jazz in the past, then maybe this song you may like. So this, you can put it as an embedding, so that you don't have to go for any sort of clustering approach, right? So basically we'll just pause and reflect on this aspect, especially design patterns which you have discussed now is embeddings. And just for 1 minute, you can move your eyes away from the screen. Okay. All right. So we were discussing about one particular design pattern, that was embeddings, and we have 4 more left. So as I said, I'll try to add as many examples as possible, and also the relevance of this kind of a design pattern. The thing is, most of the time, whenever somebody is working on a machine learning problem, certain things are not new to that specific machine learning problem. There might be some things which are kind of common and kind of can be reapplied, but unfortunately there is not a single resource, or there cannot be not a single source which can kind of point and say this is something which is similar to this problem, so if you apply this is going to work. So that actually tells the relevance of machine learning design patterns, and we'll try to move to the next problem. So this particular design pattern is actually known as rebalancing. So this pattern is solving, or it is kind of this particular pattern is kind of very common in most real world data set, which are not perfectly balanced. So you may be getting started with a multi-class classification problem, and let's assume each class has exactly thousands of examples in that data set that you are using. So unfortunately, data sets in the real world are most of the time or often not perfectly balanced. So this is an extreme example. So you can see on the bottom right corner of the screen. So you have a data set where less than 1% of the examples are from the, let's say you're thinking about a credit card fraud transactions. So the number of credit card fraud transactions is only 492. So we can say that less than 1% of the examples are from the fraudulent class. So we are most often dealing with data sets that have a different balance of data. For each class, so this could often be a kind of anomaly, and this can really be a problem when you're actually dealing with real situations, because credit card fraud detection is a very serious thing, but when you have less amount of data, that can really have an effect on your model, because you have only very few data. Majority is actually the non-fraudulent cases, right? So machine learning models learn best when they are kind of given similar number of examples for each label class in a data set. So as I said, many real world problems are not so neatly balanced. So as I mentioned, this fraud detection, or the same is true for other problems like detecting whether someone will default on a loan, or identifying defective products, or say predicting the presence of a disease and when you are given a medical image, or filtering spam emails, or flagging error logs in any of the application. So rebalancing design pattern, they primarily address how to build models with data sets where you have few examples existing for a specific class or classes. So at least some of you might be thinking, uh, you have a kind of bias happening here, right? So bias is often a bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing. So what I'm referring to is mostly when I talk on this particular feature or this particular design pattern, it's a kind of naturally occurring bias. So which means that you can't fix it by collecting more data. So assuming that the data set you're working with encapsulates all the possible data, couldn't be improved with more data collection. So you can think about this credit card fraud detection. Even if you collect more data also, the number of fraud, it will be lesser when compared to the number of transaction, number of legitimate transaction that is happening. So unfair bias, which we cover in maybe in a different design pattern, we will not talk about it right now. So I'll just name that design pattern, that is known as fairness. So this is when the data that you're working with doesn't accurately reflect the population that may be using your model. So this particular design pattern, that is rebalancing, is actually focused on this natural occurring bias, right? So a common pitfall in training models with imbalanced labeled classes is actually relying on misleading accuracy values for model evaluation. So sometimes even I've seen students coming with a imbalanced data set, coming with and saying, sir, I've got a accuracy of 99.9%, right? So most of the time what happens is they wouldn't have taken the right measuring metric, right? So the right measuring metric in the sense it could be, they would have directly taken something like accuracy. So what you want to do is that when you have an imbalanced data set, you want to make sure that you're looking at the right evaluation metric to basically understand your model. So let's say you choose the overall model, you choose accuracy as a model metric, or the measurement metric, right? So this might not always give you the best picture of your model, especially when you are dealing with an heavily imbalanced data. So let's say you have an overall model accuracy of 93. The same model, if you look closer at the accuracy by, let's say, individual classes, you'll notice that this is pretty bad, right? So this is an example of a binary classification problem. When I say minority class, I'm just referring to the class of that particular data where you have fewer examples. So it looks like from this confusion matrix, we can see that our model is only classifying example from a minority class correctly only 12% of the time, which is pretty bad. But when you're saying, hey, I have an accuracy of 93%. So you want to make sure that you choose the right metric to evaluate your model. Otherwise, you may not even uncover the issue that's actually occurring. So we focus on 3 methods to actually avoid this particular problem, that is avoid the problem of resampling, right? So since I've mentioned about the right evaluation metric, obviously some of you might have a question in your mind saying that then what could be the right evaluation metric, right? So for imbalanced data sets like the one I've shown, or like the one like a fraud detection example, it's best to use metrics like precision, recall, or F measure to kind of get a complete picture of how your model is performing. So basically, precision measures the percentage of positive classification that were correct out of all the positive prediction made by the model. And on the other hand, or conversely, the recall measures the proportion of actual positive examples that were identified correctly by the model. So the biggest difference between these two metrics is the denominator used to calculate them. So for precision, the denominator is the total number of total positive class predictions made by our model. For recall, it is the actual positive class examples present in our data set. Right? Now, for handling imbalanced data, what can we do? So we can deal with this imbalanced data using 3 different techniques. So one is downsampling, the other one is upsampling, and third one is a weighted class. So downsampling, I'm just going to give you a little preview on how exactly this looks. So let's assume that you have something of this kind of a scenario. So let's say this is the balance of your data. You have a way more number of examples for your majority class. And so with downsampling, what it suggests you to do is to discard a random sample of the examples from your majority class. And the resulting data set is much more balanced, something of this sort. Right? So you discarded some random sample so that it will be kind of balanced. Right? So you want to make sure that, let's say you're dealing with some time focused data, you want to give a thought on how you are discarding those examples, because you probably want to discard an equal amount of examples across the time that your data set includes, right? Rather than just cutting off, let's say, the first 1,000 from the beginning. So based on what your data looks like, or you want to think about how you want to downsample, you need to think. So this approach is probably the simplest of the 3, but it obviously will not work if you don't have enough minority class examples to begin with. So let's say you have 100 examples in your minority class. Downsampling probably wouldn't work, because then you'd be left only with a data set of maybe 2 or 300 total examples. So just something that you want to be aware with this downsampling. So it's the easiest one, but always be careful before you do this, right? So downsampling can be done very easily. Just downsample the majority class and use all the instances of the minority class, train a model, add it to the ensemble, train it again with a different model. You keep repeating it, and maybe finally you can take the median output of all these ensemble models, right? So of course, this can be even applied to regression problems also. It's not confined to classification problems alone. So let's assume if you're predicting a numerical value, in this case, you are taking a random sample of majority class, and it will be kind of nuanced, since the majority class in our data includes a range of values rather than a single label, right? So the other aspect is, or the other method is upsampling. It's again the opposite of downsampling, where you generate new data and add it to this minority class. So basically, this would be the initially it was like this, and this would be the resulting data set that you are dealing with. So looking at upsampling, let's say we are started with some data set imbalance. This technique is a little bit more complex, but basically you do the reverse of downsampling. So here you generate data, or it can be synthetic data based on your other examples which you already have inside your minority class. There are a couple of ways you can do this, but there's a popular technique called the SMOTE, SMOTE, which is in existence for the past 8 to 9 years, which stands for say synthetic minority oversampling technique. And it's a very good paper which you can take a look at it. And basically this paper actually proposes you to take real examples from your minority class, and here you just have a sample data, and that's predicting. Let's say assume that you have a medical data such that you have a patient with heart disease and the other set of patients without heart disease. So what SMOTE will do is that it will look at this feature space of these data points, and then it will use this to generate new data points from the same feature space. So yeah, something of the sort. I missed to change the slide. So basically this is how it looks like. So this synthetic minority oversampling technique is a very heavily used one. Even I remember I've used this in my PhD research also. So specifically with respect to social networking data, where you have something like a cold start problem when initially when a person joins a network, how would be the scenario? So I didn't have enough data points for that new person. So I had to create more data using this particular technique. So basically, this is the other approach, that is we initially have seen about downsampling, then we have talked about upsampling. Then there is one more method which is known as the weighted class. So you can think of weighted class in this way, where you're giving or you're paying more attention to this minority class. So so example, in your, if you're a data set, you can think about it that like saying that you're just saying paying more attention to me and focus more on these minority class. So the weighted classes approach is basically you want to tell your model when it's calculating the loss or error metric to assign more weight to examples from the minority class. And when it does that, this is possible to implement in many different machine learning frameworks, this kind of weighting, right? So ultimately, you can even make use of all these technique in an ensemble way. That is, maybe initially you can do some downsampling, then you can, if you can do a upsampling, a kind of combination of these things, it can really work magic sometimes. So that's all with the solution with respect to the rebalancing pattern. So initially we have seen about the first thing related to the problem description, that is embeddings. Then we have talked about rebalancing, and moving on, the third one is actually known as continuous model evaluation. So especially in the academia or in any of the academic projects, what students usually does is they'll create a model, they'll get the output, right, and that's the end of the story. But when you talk about any real world industry projects, what happens is you create a model. So then once you deploy it, you may have a lot of issues coming into it. So recently I was talking to one of my students. So that time he was saying, like, sir, we have built the model in hardly 2 to 3 weeks and the model is ready. But for the past 11 months, we are trying to deploy it, right? So maybe a lot of issues comes when you are deploying. And even if you deploy it, still again, you may have a lot of issues popping up, right? So let's assume that a company like Amazon, if they are deploying a machine learning or a new recommendation algorithm, when you actually deploy that particular model, maybe within a day or two, they may start getting the feedback, right? Sometimes, let's talk about Netflix. If it is sometimes suggesting movies that we don't understand, why is that recommending this particular movie to me, right? So sometimes you would have asked such kind of questions to yourself, right? So what happens is whenever you have this kind of a model, continuous evaluation is actually required. So the purpose of a machine learning model is to use it to make inferences on data it hasn't seen during training. Therefore, once a model has been trained, it is typically deployed onto a production environment and used to make predictions in response to the incoming request. So you can think of a model like some kind of a box, and whatever that comes inside it, it gives the output, right? So software that is deployed onto production environments is expected to be kind of resilient and require very little in the way of human intervention to keep it running. So that's what is expected. Once you deploy it, you don't have to again and again tweak it. That is actually the intended one. But in a real world thing, you require this continuous monitoring or continuous model evaluation. So assume that you have trained your model, you have collected the raw data, cleaned it up, you engineered the features, and you created the embedding layers, you tuned the hyperparameters, and you have deployed or you have made your first model, right? And you are able to achieve an accuracy of, let's say, 96% on your testing. Like, amazing. You have gone through the all these processing, and you just made a REST API, and you just deployed it as in a website, right? So you have done it, and you assume that you're done with the job, but not quite right. Deployment is not the end of machine learning models life cycle. So how do you know that your model is working as expected in the actual field, right? So what if there are unexpected changes in the incoming data, or what if the model no longer produces accurate or useful predictions? So how will these changes be detected? Because the world we are living is a very dynamic world. Developing machine learning model, usually most of the people assume that as a static model. From the, like, you have some historical data, you create a model, and that's the end of the road, right? So this means that, but that's unfortunately that's not the scenario. So which means that once a model goes into production, it can start to degrade, and the predictions can grow increasingly unreliable. So this is where this continuous model evaluation design pattern handles the common problem of detecting when a deployed model is no longer fit for the purpose. So imagine about any of the say big recommendation systems, as I said, Amazon or Netflix, right? They cannot down their system to deploy a new model, right? So how do they actually do it? So usually this is one of my favorite ML lifecycle diagram. So here you can see right from the use case, from data exploration, you select an algorithm, you do again feature engineering, you build the model, you evaluate. Maybe this till 1 to 6, even in an academic project, you would have experienced this kind of a task, right? But once you're done with and you have some result, and again you may be kind of retweaking your particular model, and you can you deploy it in over there. And obviously one of the thing which usually most of the industries like spend more time to do is actually monitoring that model, right? So the ML life cycle usually, as you can see, it is basically divided into like discovery, development, and deployment. So there is a canonical order to the individual steps of each in these stage, right? So how these steps are completed in an iterative manner, and earlier steps may be revisited again and again depending on the outcomes and insights gathered from later stages, right? So as I said, model deployment is a continuous process, and to solve for things like concept drift or data drift, it is necessary to kind of update your training data set and retrain your model with fresh data to improve predictions. So this is the second time I'm referring to something like concept drift or data drift. So in maybe in the next slide, I'll explain what exactly is actually this kind of drift. What do you mean by this drift, right? So how do you know when actually you require a retraining of your model? So how often should you retrain? So data pre-processing and model data processing as well as model building and training can be costly, both with time and money, and each of these steps will have some additional overhead of development, monitoring, and maintenance, right? So that's a portion where there is more relevance for this continuous model evaluation. So when you're working on any problem, you deploy it and you're actually continuously monitoring it, and then the idea is that you'll be able to track the model's performance over time, so that you can recognize this when it is behaving very badly, or when your model is predicting everything wrongly, right? So when that happens, you can fix your model or improve your model when it's no longer performing its task which is intended to do. And maybe in the next couple of slides, I'll just give you why exactly this is happening, right? something which was working fine, but over time, why is it becoming stale, right? One thing is called the concept drift. So concept drift occurs when the relationship between the model inputs and target have actually changed. So this often happens when your underlying assumptions of your model have changed, because whenever you have a machine learning problem, you will deeply study that particular problem and then only you build a model. So assume that some of the assumptions which you have made while building the model, that has changed, right? So that is very true with respect to things like fraud detection, spam filters, or if you think about stock market trading, online ad bidding, or machine learning in cybersecurity. In all these aspects, a predictive model aims to identify patterns that are characteristics of a desired activity. So in these cases, if you are actually building a model, at the same time you should remember that the adversary or the person who is doing all these mischief things, he also learns to adapt, right, and may modify their behavior as the circumstances change, right? Think, for example, a model developed to detect credit card fraud. So the way people use credit card, uh, for instance, has changed over time. Thus, it's a common character of credit card where you have this chip and pin technology, right? So then when you have this thing, that is, earlier you don't have to type a pin. Especially, I remember maybe 10 years back, if you have a credit card and if somebody gets it without even typing a pin, you will be able to do the transactions, right? So once this chip and pin technology was introduced, fraudulent transactions began to move more online, right? So it's much harder to do or commit fraud or have a credit card fraud in person, that causes the data to change. And so the models that you had developed to recognize the fraud, they are no longer good, because the data has actually changed, right? As fraudulent behavior adapted, the performance of a model that had been deployed before this technology would suddenly begin to suffer, and model predictions would be very less accurate, right? So concept of one more example I'll show you. So for example, 7 years back, if somebody is saying the word troll, we would have thought that as either a kind of small little doll, right? But now we know that troll means it's a meme, right? Something which is made to make fun of someone or something in a positive way, right? So, or if you think about cell, right? 25 years back, if someone says about cell, it can either mean a battery or it can mean the actual jail, right? Or say 15, 20 years, if somebody is talking about cloud, we always thought about the clouds in the sky, right? But now we know that what is cloud computing. And also, even 3, 4 years back, if you are saying about fog computing or fog, we would have thought that as a mist-like fog which you actually see, right? So this is actually this idea of, or this is actually the concept, or this is actually the point which I'm trying to make with respect to concept drift, right? So ultimately, since the meaning of these words has changed over time, earlier when the model was built, it had a different meaning, and you had the surroundings and interpretations has changed over the time, and obviously your model will suffer in the long time or in the long run, right? So in addition to this concept drift, there is another aspect called data drift, where you that is also one of the reason where you can have the models becoming stale, right? So this refers to any change that has occurred in the data that you're using for feeding to your model for prediction. That anything that's changed from what the day used for training, and that can happen due to like various number of reasons, and sometimes the feature distributions can change over time, right? And it may not even have that the structural schema to predict that. One good example I'd like to say here is the recent example during the start of the pandemic. There's an article from MIT Technological Review, which is that Amazon saw this massive shift and the type of orders that people were making during the pandemic. Right? So people were buying, people were buying more in bulk than they are buying a lot of items related to the COVID pandemic. Right? And as this article points out, you don't just train a model and walk away and be done with it. You should really think about model deployment as a continual process. So how do you go about doing that? It may seem really obvious, but what you need is the simplest way to put it is that you need some way to compare your model predictions with the ground truth. The reason why I'm saying is, say if you think about it, there's something you do during your model development, like you're training your model, exploring how good it is. You have your training and validation test, and you're training on your training data, right? So you already know what is the ground truth at that time, right? So the idea of continuous evaluation is just carrying over that practice into the deployment stage, and also keep continuing it. And the only way you can really do that is that if you have a way of capturing the requests of your model for predictions, your model predictions, and then you need to have some way to tie that back with the actual ground truth. So model deployment is a continuous process, as I mentioned, and to solve for concept drift or data drift, it is necessary to update your training data set and retrain your model with fresh data to improve these predictions. But how do you know that when should I retrain my model, or whether retraining is necessary? How often should I retrain? So data pre-processing and model training can be really costly, both in time and money. And each step of the model development cycle adds additional overhead with respect to development, monitoring, and maintenance, as I already mentioned. Right. So the most direct way to identify this thing is actually to check the predictive performance over time, right? And in most situations, the real challenge is it may take some time for the ground truth labels to become available. Let's say that you made a recommendation to buy someone or to buy something in an e-commerce platform, right? So whether the recommendation is right or wrong, it completely depends on like whether that person has actually bought it or not. So that will take some time, right? So whether your recommendation is right or wrong, you need some time to actually kind of validate it, right? So because you don't have the ready-made ground truth values or labels available. So again, for example, you are thinking about a customer churn prediction or churn model. So it may not be known until the next subscription cycle, like whether the customer have discontinued their service or not. Or if you are thinking about a financial forecasting model, the true revenue isn't known until after that quarter's close and earnings report. In either of these cases, the valuation cannot take place until the ground truth data is available. Right. So ultimately, for the continuous evaluation, let's assume the performance evaluation on a text classification model. So just to frame the problem, we have a data set which consists of a whole bunch of article titles and a label, and you're just trying to put it into three buckets, whether it is from New York Times, or whether it is from TechCrunch, or whether it belongs to GitHub. Right. So we train the model. Once you've trained the model, what we can do is we can deploy and be able to serve a model for predictions from say some REST API. And when a user sends a request, you ask like what is the source of an article, this particular thing, right? So it will be able to predict it, right? So the raw data in this case is just the text of the article, and the confidence score which this model prediction has done, that also can be noted over a period of time, right? So basically after that you have to go back and look at this the actual ground truth label, right? So this can be done in many ways. Of course, setting up human labeling service, or more likely what's going to happen is you will have to kind of go back and you look at these examples and someone will provide you the ground truth. That is the basic assumption, right? So as I said, model performance is going to degrade over time. And so this continuous evaluation allows you to measure precisely how much in a structured way, and also it provides a trigger to kind of retrain the model. So does that mean you should retrain your model as soon as performance starts to dip? It depends. It depends on what kind of problem you're working with. So the answer to this kind of a question is heavily tied to the business use case or the particular use case which you are dealing with. So imagine you are capturing the date, time of when your this request came and when the model has predicted. right? So you can think of providing a framework to evaluate exclusively on new data, and it can ideally you can set up a threshold beforehand. So you see, okay, the performance of my model dips below a certain amount, and that's a signal to kind of retrain the model. So it could be either a problem with the data drift, or it could be a problem with concept drift. So because the problem here is it may take some time to actually kind of get the ground truth labels. So uh, basically, if you say, imagine that uh, sometimes it takes some huge amount of time to actually get the get this ground truth labels, right? So the threshold itself could be set as an kind of an absolute value. For example, model retraining occurs once the model accuracy falls below 95%. Some kind of threshold you can keep. So, or the threshold could be set as a rate of change of performance. Say once the performance begins to experience a downward trajectory, or whichever approach you want to choose, you can have certain kind of checkpoints during the training. So basically, this particular figure, it shows the trade-off between performance threshold and how it affects the number of model retraining jobs, right? So continuous evaluation provides a crucial signal for knowing when it's necessary to retrain your model, and this process of retraining is often carried out by fine-tuning the previous model using any newly collected data. So where continued evaluation may happen every day, scheduled retraining jobs may occur only every week or maybe once in every month, right? Something of that sort, right? So we'll take a very quick break over here. So just give me a second. Yeah. So we have seen about three different patterns. We started with embeddings, then we talked about rebalancing, and third one we talked about continuous model evaluation. So you can move your eyes away from the screen. All right. So moving on to the next particular use case, we have the uh, the reproducibility design pattern, and it is known as a model versioning, right? So if you think about software best practices such as unit testing, it is assumed that if you run a piece of code, it produces a deterministic output, right? So I'm sure those who are from computer science background would have learned about the theory of computer science, and you have this wonderful deterministic machines and the fantastic non-deterministic machines, right? So uh, so basically, all those programming languages or all the softwares which we build, it produces deterministic output, right? So this sort of reproducibility is difficult in machine learning. During training, as I mentioned, machine learning models are initialized with random values and then adjusted on training data. So if you can think about a simple k-means algorithm implemented by any of the packages, say scikit-learn, right? So it requires setting the random state in order to ensure the algorithm returns the same result each time. So beyond this random seed, there are many other artifacts that need to be fixed in order to ensure reproducibility during this training. So in model versioning design pattern, this backward compatibility is achieved by deploying a changed model as a microservice with a different REST endpoint. So REST endpoint is you with the assumption that you have deployed it over the web somewhere, right? So this is a necessary prerequisite for many other design patterns as well. So here, I would also like to talk about something called a data drift, or how data drift models can become stale over time and need to be updated regularly to make sure they reflect an organizations say training data, right? So deploying model updates to production will inevitably affect the way models behave on new data, which presents a challenge, right? So updates to an existing model might include, say, changing a model's architecture in order to improve accuracy, or retraining a model on a more recent data to address this data drift. Earlier, I've talked about concept drift, and here I want to talk about something called the data drift, right? So I'll show you one example where what exactly is data drift. So basically, all these types of changes likely may not require a different model output format, but that will affect the prediction result which users are getting from a model. So sometimes it's required to kind of update it, right? So training on this updated data set improves our overall model accuracy. So this is very much similar to continuous model evaluation, which we have discussed previously. So uh, ultimately, when to use model versioning and when to use continuous model evaluation, that I'll be discussing in another few slides, right? So basically, if you think about data drift, so data drift refers to this statistical property of your underlying data or your features changing uh, changing over time. So let's say you're building a model to predict some sort of flight trend, and here you can see a graph of how flight trends have changed over a 15-year period. So if you train your model on data from, let's say, the last or the first 5 years of this, it might do a decent job at predicting flight trends in 2010, right? But probably it wouldn't be so accurate in predicting flight trends as on today, because you need to be constantly updating your model to make sure that it's still performing well, right? So another example could be like, imagine that you have all the data about cyclones happening in the Bay of Bengal or in the Arabian Sea. Let's assume that you have only data till the year 2000, right? From 1950 to 2000. So today, if you are building a cyclone prediction model, and if you are using the data from 1950 to 2000, then obviously your model will not perform well, and it will be a very bad model. And the reason could be this data drift. So data drift can cause models to become stale. Just like concept drift, data drift is also is of huge concern, right? So there's a lot of reasons that you might want to update your model, as we talked about, due to concept or data drift, or you may just have new data. So maybe you're building a model to predict whether or not someone will make a purchase of an item which they have added to their cart. So, and you have 9 months of data available, and then suddenly you have an additional 3 months of data, uh, 3 months, and so you want to update your model and train on it so that this this new data to capture that seasonality, right? Maybe the underlying framework you're using has changed. So maybe you are using TensorFlow, or they have updated the version, or you want to take advantage of some of those TensorFlow features, or for some performance benefit. So end users might request a change. Maybe your model's output format might also may have new data schema, right? So to gracefully handle updates to a model, deploy multiple model versions with different endpoints. So which means that if you can access a particular model in via web browser, each may be stored in different addresses, right? So this actually ensures backward compatibility by keeping these multiple versions of model at a given time. So I'm talking from a developer perspective, because the advantage of model versioning is that it will help you in performing even a kind of like a to B testing in a model, right? So when you're talking about models, we are actually looking at two types of model users. When we refer to the end users of a model, this includes two different groups. One, if you're making a model API endpoint available to, say, some application developers outside uh, the organization, outside your company, these developers can be thought of as one type of model user. So let's assume that Google has their speech APIs, right? So it is actually developed by Google, but as a programmer, I may be accessing it as an application developer, right? So the backward compatibility of these versions is most important for these application developers. So if the format of a model's response changes, application developers may want to use an older version when they've updated their application code to support the latest response format. The other set of group is the end users. Those are using an application that calls our deployed model. So if you are just making use of your mobile phone to talk to the Google personal assistant, saying "Okay, Google," so then what happens is you are the end user, and you're just making use of that application. So these are the two different class of or two different types of model users. Right? So we can deploy different versions of your model as different microservices into different REST endpoints. So roughly this is how it looks like. You have your data scientist and ML engineer team building the model, and they have all these model internals that deploy that model to different REST endpoints. So each version of the model is actually deployed to a separate endpoint. So then the application developers on the other end, they ping that endpoint and they choose which one they want, and they just take that particular endpoint. Right? So model versioning has this different REST endpoints. Definitely, it has these advantages. So it allows for backward compatibility, and also it allows for fine-grained performance monitoring. So you can see how different versions are performing. Sometimes even with an update, you can have issues, and so that you can easily they can shift to the old one, right? So, and also in addition to that, it can decouple the model changes from the front end. So imagine that your data science team is working on a data science project, and you have different models. Maybe some of them are using XGBoost, some of them are using TensorFlow, right? So so ultimately, if you want to switch over from one model to the other one, then you may have to create a higher accuracy version of the TensorFlow model, rather than the data science team having to explain it to the application developers. What they can do is, hey, this is the exported file format of my model change, say frm.bst for XGBoost to TensorFlow's model format. This is how you have to call the model. So that is the only thing they need to tell the application developers, and the application developers easily can do that required changes at their end. Right? So obviously, one question which I've earlier also asked: should I go for a new model or a new version? So one caution to keep in mind is that when you're looking at this pattern, this design pattern, that is model versioning, is thinking about whether you should create a new version or a new model altogether. So the rule of thumb, usually it is recommended that if your prediction task is changing, or if the new version would break existing clients, instead create a new model. So in those cases, just go for a new model. So a quick example could be, let's say if you're building a flight, let's say if you are building a model to predict the flight delays, we start with a, let's say, regression model that predicts the delay in minutes. So it outputs a new numerical value, and then the clients that are using this model say that we classify delay as 15 minutes. You want to do some more classification. If the delay is more than 50 minutes or so, then it should just give me a categorical label saying that yes, it is delayed. If it is not more than 15 minutes, then you don't have to do this. So in this case, you want to create a new model altogether, because your output format is changing, and this would break anyone that is pinging your model, right? So I'm talking about the REST API side. So in the next example, let's say that you want to say, for example, you want to simply update the model, and you don't have any change in the output. So in those cases, you can very well just create a new version, right? So this is how you can decide on whether should I go for a new model or whether should I go for a new version, right? And coming on to the last design pattern, it's known as bridged schema, right? So in databases, definitely all of you would have heard about schemas in database design. So in bridge schema design, this particular pattern provides ways to adapt the data used to train model from its older original data schema to a newer, better data. So this pattern is really useful when an input provider makes improvements to their data feed. So it often takes time for enough data of the improved schema to be collected and to adequately train a replacement model, right? So the bridge schema pattern allows us to use as much as of the newer data that is available, and also it helps to augment it with some older data to improve the model accuracy. So I'll just show you a use case. So consider a point of sale application, POS application that suggests how much you should tip to a particular delivery person. Let's assume you are using Swiggy or Zomato or something, and it is just giving a suggestion how much you should tip that particular delivery person, right? So the application might use a machine learning model that predicts the tip amount, taking into account the order amount, delivery time, delivery distance, and so on. And such a model will be trained on the actual tips added by customers, right? Now, assume that one of the inputs to the model is the payment type. So in the historical data, whatever you have done till now, there has been recorded as only cash or card. Right? When you have started, you thought about only these two features, right? And you assume that only the payment type is either going to be cash or it is going to be card. However, let's say the payment system has been upgraded and it now provides more detail on the type of card, that is asking whether it is a gift card or whether it is a debit card or whether it is a credit card, right? And now you can even have this Google Pay or Paytm or all these UPI transfers are also more relevant and more common, right? So then in this case, uh, so so you have some additional schema added on to your existing thing. So this is extremely useful information because the tipping behavior varies between the three types of cards, right? So when you train the model, the payment type that you got from the device that someone uses to basically swipe, right? So you basically got that it was either a cash payment or it was a card payment. But over time, let's say a few months or a couple of years, rather than just getting as a card payment, you decided that you will have these things. So earlier the scenario was it was just cash versus card. Now you have more options added onto it, right? Now the problem right now you'll be facing is, you know, that when you trained your model, you use the million transaction, historical transaction to train your model, and that time you have considered only cash and card. That was only two things, right? Now, if you want to build a recommender system after incorporating this credit card, gift card, and debit card, you may have to wait some time to get new data. So to get million transactions, you may have to wait some months, so that you will have enough data. And like this waiting time can be really painful, and also really can be costing the company a lot, because it may give some wrong predictions, right? So we cannot train a new model exclusively on the newer data, because the quantity of newer data will be quite small, limited to the say the number of transactions after this upgrade. So because the quality of an ML model is highly dependent on the amount of data which is used to train it. So right now you have a kind of imbalance, that is, you have certain things just named as cash and card, and you have some things like which is specifically saying like whether it is a debit card or credit card or gift card, right? So the solution to this kind of a thing is the model trained with new data, since it has less amount of data, that can that can give you very poor results, right? So the solution to this kind of a scenario is that to go for a bridge schema, that is to match this old data with the new data. So then we train an ML model using much of the new data that is available, and augment it with the older data, right? So consider the case where the older data has two categories, that is cash and card. In the new schema, the CAT category is now much more granular. You have gift, debit, and credit, right? So what we do now is that a transaction can be coded as card in the old data, would have been one of these types, but the actual type was not recorded. So it's possible to bridge the schema either probabilistically or statistically. So I'll just mention about this thing. So imagine that you have only 5,000 new transactions that were paid with a card, and you also know the payment type, whether it is a gift card or debit card, or whether it is a credit card, or if it was cash. So in such scenario, or in this scenario, you have only 5,000 such things. But remember, the actual model was built on 1 million transactions. So 5,000 is a very small number compared to 1 million. So here, if you go for a probabilistic approach, imagine that we estimate from the newer training data the number of card transactions. That is, out of that 5,000, let's assume 10% are gift cards, 30% are debit cards, and 60% are credit cards. So each time an older training example is loaded, that is, older training example means that before we introduce these different kinds of cards. So each time an older training example is loaded onto the trainer program, we could choose the card type by generating a uniformly distributed random number in the range from 0 to 100. So, and choosing a gift card when the random number is less than 10, a debit card if it is, say, 10 to 40, and a credit card in all the other cases. So provided we train this for enough epochs, any training example would be presented as all the three categories, but proportional to the actual frequency of occurrence. So the newer training example, of course, would always have the actual recorded category. So the justification for this kind of a probabilistic approach is that we treat each older example as having happened 100 times, even though it hasn't happened. That is the assumption. So as the trainer goes through the data, or when you are building the model, in each epoch, we simulate one of these instances. So in the simulation, we expect that 10% of the time that a card was used, the transaction would have occurred with a gift card. That's why we pick the gift card for the value of the categorical input, say 10% over the time. And this is, of course, simplistic, because gift cards are used 10% of the time. Overall, it is not the case gift cards will be used 10% of the time for any specific transaction. So as an extreme example, maybe taxi companies disallow use of gift cards on airport trips. So a gift card is not even a legal value for some of the historical examples. Right? However, in the absence of any extra information, we'll assume that the frequency distribution is the same for all historical examples. Right? So this is the probabilistic approach. Now, coming to the static approach, here what we do is these categorical variables can be one-hot encoded. One-hot encoded means that instead of, say, you can see here, you have a 0, 0.1, 0.3, and 0.6. So the first 0 correspond to cash category, second number 0.1 correspond to gift card transactions, and 1 will be, say, debit card, 0.3 will be for debit card, and 0.6 for credit card. So to bridge the older data into the newer schema, we can transform the older categorical data to this representation, where we insert a priori probability of the new classes as estimated from the training data. So this newer data, on the other hand, it will have, say, 0010 for a transaction that is known to have been paid by a debit card. So you have 4 things, and whichever one is true, that one will be converted into a true, or into a value of 1. Right? So usually it is recommended to use a static method over the probabilistic method, because it's effectively what happens if the probabilistic method runs for long enough. It is also much simpler to implement, since every card payment from the old data will have the exact value, some kind of a 4-element array, right? But and also it generates numbers in the probabilistic method. It's very computationally less expensive. But it's also extremely important to compare the performance of the newer trained model on these bridged examples against the older. So unchanged model on the unchanged model on this evaluation data set, right? So it might be the case that the new information does not have any aggregate value. That is the other aspect, right? So we have seen 5 different machine learning design patterns. So these are the things, right? So as I mentioned, I haven't touched upon model training and responsible AI. The reason is they are very broad, and each design pattern can be given as a separate talk. So that is the reason why I've just chosen from the 4 verticals. One is data representation, problem representation, then resilience, serving, reproducibility. And reproducibility, I have mentioned about 2 things, right? So coming to the conclusion, design patterns are definitely utilized throughout the course of any machine learning development cycle, and it will be used regardless of the production use case, right? So whether it is if you are working on NLP, or whether you are working on computer vision, or whether you are working on any other say deep learning frameworks, this design patterns will hold true or will be relevant in all these cases. So some of the domains where it has a lot of design patterns is actually, one is natural language understanding, NLU. So there are many use cases which falls under the umbrella of this NLU, and it can be applied to a lot of processes such as say text classification, entity extraction, or question answering, or speech recognition, text summarization, sentiment analysis, or all these things. One we have seen about something like embedding. So in that, if you remember, I've mentioned an example of a sentence, right? So if you think about computer vision, right, in over there also, most of these classical application on computer vision, like image classification, or image detection, or object detection, video motion analysis, or image segmentation, or image denoising, all these cases also it is going to be relevant, right? And in predictive modeling also, you have a lot of things happening, including say energy forecasting, or customer churn prediction, financial modeling, or weather prediction, or when it comes to IoT analytics, that's also a very broad category that sits within predictive analytics. So IoT models rely on data collected by internet connected sensors called say IoT devices. So say imagine that a commercial aircraft that has thousands of sensors will be collecting more than 2 terabytes of data per day, right? It depends on the number of hours it flies, of course, right? And when it comes to recommender system also, you have a lot of use cases which will be very relevant with respect to this machine learning design patterns. And many financial institutions, both corporate as well as non-corporate, they make use of this fraud detection to keep their consumers' accounts safe, right? So in all these cases, you can find these patterns anywhere and everywhere. So if you want to read more about this, definitely that will be helpful if you are actually working on a real ML problem, and if you are finding a roadblock, then obviously you can refer to these design patterns to see what they have done to solve that particular problem, right? And that is all with this machine learning design patterns, and these are some of the references which I've used for making these slides and as well as this talk. And as you can see, there are only very few works being done till now, so there is a lot of scope even for further research in this machine learning design pattern. So if any one of you are interested in pursuing PhD or doing some small projects in this, definitely this is going to be a very lucrative area in the coming years, right? And with that, thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us with knowledge on the topic design patterns in machine learning. Dear participants, now it's a time for discussion and question and answer session. So please ask the queries if any, or you can post it in the chat window.